Welcome aboard the dark waters of the Nite Krew podcast, where true crime meets the unknown. Each month we dive into the eerie, the unsolved, and the stories that haunt the shadows. If it's creepy, mysterious, or just plain unsettling, you'll find it here. So light your lantern, step onto the deck, and prepare to uncover what lies beneath the surface.
This podcast contains discussions of true crime, disturbing content, and mature themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The Nite Krew podcast aims to present stories with respect to the victims and their families, and the intent is never to sensationalize tragedy, but to shed light on the unknown and unexplained.
Welcome to episode 30 of The Nite Krew, where we dive into true crime, paranormal encounters in the darkest corners of the supernatural. Tonight's story takes us back more than a century to a quiet Midwestern town where nothing ever seemed to happen until one summer night changed everything. A night filled with silence, shadows, and an evil that would leave behind one of the most infamous unsolved murders in American history. This is the story of the horrors that unfolded inside the home now known as the Villisca Axe Murder House. And more chilling still, many believe the victims never truly left. The year was 1912. In early 20th century America, Villisca, Iowa was the kind of town where life moved slowly, where people left their doors unlocked at night, where neighbors didn't just know each other, they relied on each other. It was a kind of place where tragedy felt impossible, because nothing bad was ever supposed to happen there. On the evening of June 9th, 1912, the town gathered for its usual Sunday church service. The air was warm, the sky beginning to darken, and the sound of the evening bells drifted softly through the streets as families made their way into the small white church at the center of town. Among them was the Moore family. At the head of the household was Joshua Moore, a well-known and well-liked businessman who owned a local hardware store. He was seen as dependable, hardworking, and deeply rooted in the community. Beside him was his wife, Sarah Moore, a devoted mother known for her quiet kindness and steady presence in the home. Their 4 children were with them that evening. Even after the service ended around 9:30 p.m., the walk home was peaceful. Families lingered outside the church, exchanging goodbyes and small conversation before heading back into the darkening streets. The Moores weren't alone that night. 2 young sisters, Lena and Ina Stillinger, had been invited to stay overnight at the Moore home. Sleepovers were common, innocent, and safe. Or at least they were supposed to be. By the time the family reached their home at 508 East 2nd Street, the town had already begun to settle into sleep. Inside the house, the evening unfolded normally. Sarah prepared the children for bed. The lamps were extinguished one by one. Soft voices faded into quiet, and eventually, the house fell completely still. Outside, Villisca drifted into silence. No movement, no noise, just the steady hum of a sleeping town under a dark summer sky. But inside the Moore residence, something had already gone terribly wrong. Sometime after midnight, investigators would later conclude someone entered the home, or perhaps never left it in the first place. What happened next would turn that quiet Sunday night into one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. And by morning, 8 people would be dead. On the morning of June 10th, 1912, concern first arose when the Moore family failed to follow their normal morning routine. The Moore household was known to keep regular hours, and neighbors expected activity early in the day. When no movement was seen inside the home that morning, a neighbor named Mary Peckham became concerned. Mary approached the house at approximately 7 a.m. She knocked on the door but received no response. According to later accounts, she also noticed that the curtains remained drawn and the house appeared unusually quiet. After receiving no answer, Mary contacted Ross Moore, the brother of Josiah Moore, and asked him to come to the residence. Ross Moore arrived shortly afterward and used a spare key to unlock the front door. Once inside, Ross Moore immediately noticed signs that something was wrong. Historical records indicate that he observed blood inside the house and quickly exited the residence without conducting a full search. Authorities were then contacted. Law enforcement responded to the Moore residence shortly after notification. Among the first officials on scene was Henry Horton, who began the initial investigation. As officers entered the home, they conducted a room-by-room search. The first bodies discovered were those of Josiah Moore and Sarah Moore, located in the master bedroom on the second floor. Both victims had suffered severe head trauma caused by repeated blows from an axe. Further examination of the house revealed the bodies of the Moore children in their respective bedrooms. Herman Moore, age 11, Mary Moore, age 10, Arthur Moore, age 7, and Paul Moore, age 5. The final two victims were located in the downstairs guest bedroom. These victims were identified as Lena Stillinger, age 12, and Ina Stillinger, age 8. The Stillinger sisters had attended church with the Moore family on the evening of June 9th and were invited to spend the night at the Moore residence. All 8 victims had been killed in their beds. Medical observations indicated that the victims were attacked while sleeping. News of the murders spread quickly throughout Villisca and surrounding communities. Within hours, large crowds gathered outside the Moore residence. Local newspapers reported widespread fear among residents, particularly because the killer had not been identified. One early newspaper account described the reaction of the town, stating, "The entire community is in a state of terror, and the crime stands as one of the most shocking in the history of the state." By the end of June 10th, 1912, the murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters had become one of the most widely discussed crimes in Iowa history. And at that point, investigators had very few leads. Investigators quickly determined that all 8 victims had been attacked with an axe. The weapon was later identified as an axe belonging to the Moore household. It had been taken from the property and used during the murders. Medical examination showed that the victims had been struck repeatedly in the head while they were asleep in their beds. Reports from the time noted that most victims were found with blankets pulled up over their heads, suggesting the attacker may have covered their faces either before or after the attacks. According to historical documentation, the killer appeared to move slowly from room to room. The murders were believed to have taken place sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. One particularly disturbing detail involved the condition of the mirrors inside the home. Investigators reported that several mirrors had been covered with clothing or fabric. Windows were also covered, preventing anyone from seeing inside. Food was found in the kitchen area, including partially eaten items, suggesting the killer may have remained inside the home for some time after the murders were completed. A local newspaper later described the crime scene in stark detail. One report stated, "The murderer showed no mercy. Every member of the household was struck down in their beds, and the wounds inflicted were one of the most brutal character. another report described the unusual handling of the weapon. The axe used in the crime had been wiped clean of blood and returned to its place inside the house. This detail raised serious questions among investigators. Why would the killer remain inside long enough to clean the weapon? And why leave it behind? Historical records indicate that the crime scene was not properly secured in the early hours after discovery. In fact, townspeople were allowed to enter the home before investigators had completed their work. Reports indicate that dozens of people walked through the house, potentially contaminating evidence. Some accounts suggest that items were moved or touched before authorities could fully document the scene. This early mishandling of evidence would later become one of the most significant obstacles in solving the case. So this is an estimated timeline. Based on witness accounts and medical examinations, investigators believed the family returned home from church around 9:45 p.m. The household likely went to sleep shortly after 10 p.m. The murders occurred sometime after midnight, they believe, and then the bodies were discovered around 7 a.m. on June 10th. Despite the brutality of the attack, no one in neighboring homes reported hearing screams or any signs of struggle, which is so odd for something so horrific. Following the discovery of the murders on June 10th, investigators began searching for possible suspects. However, the investigation faced immediate challenges. As previously noted, the crime scene had been contaminated by numerous townspeople entering the home before law enforcement could properly secure the crime scene. This significantly limited the amount of usable physical evidence. Investigators initially focused on individuals who may have had conflicts with Josiah Moore, as well as known criminals who had been active in the region. Authorities conducted interviews with local residents and examined the Moore family's personal and business relationships. One of the earliest theories involved the possibility that the murders were connected to business rivalries. Investigators learned that Josiah Moore had previously worked for a local businessman named Frank Jones. Frank Jones was a prominent figure in Villisca. He owned several businesses and had influence within the community. At one time, Josiah Moore had been employed by Frank. However, Moore later left Jones's business and started his own hardware store, which eventually became successful. Some investigators and townspeople believe there may have been tension between the two men. Additionally, rumors circulated that Moore may have had a personal relationship with a woman connected to Frank Jones, though historians continue to debate the accuracy of these claims. While these suspicions attracted attention, investigators were unable to find physical evidence directly linking Frank Jones to the murders. Despite this, Frank Jones remained a widely discussed suspect in the court of public opinion. Another major subject was William Mansfield. William Mansfield was known to authorities due to connections with other violent crimes. Some investigators believe Mansfield may have been involved in a series of axe murders that occurred in several Midwestern states during the early 1900s. One investigator in particular, J.N. Wilkerson, strongly supported the theory that Mansfield was responsible. Wilkerson believed the Villisca murders were part of a larger pattern involving similar killings. According to Wilkerson, Mansfield had been present in Illinois during another axe murder case and later traveled through Iowa around the time of the Villisca murders. Wilkerson eventually gathered witness statements that he believed placed Mansfield in Villisca during the time period of the crime. However, Mansfield consistently denied involvement. A key issue in this line of investigation was Mansfield's alibi. Records indicated that Mansfield may have been in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. This alibi was supported by several witnesses. As a result, authorities were unable to formally charge Mansfield with the Villisca murders. Despite this, suspicion remained due to the similarities between the Villisca case and other unsolved axe killings. As details of the case spread, newspapers across the country began reporting on the murders. The brutality of the crime, combined with the fact that an entire family had been killed in their sleep, captured national attention. Many residents in Villisca began locking their doors at night, something that had previously been uncommon in small Midwestern towns. Newspapers described the growing fear among residents. One article published shortly after the murder stated, "Citizens now live in dread that the murderer may still be at large among them." Despite intense public pressure, investigators struggled to identify a clear suspect. And within months of the murders, attention would shift toward a man whose behavior raised serious concern. A traveling minister named George Kelly. His involvement would eventually lead to one of the most dramatic developments in the case. So, George Kelly, often referred to as Reverend Kelly. So, George was an English-born minister who traveled frequently throughout the Midwest during the early 1900s. Investigators became interested in Kelly after reviewing records showing that he had been in Villisca around the time of the murders in June of 1912. Historical records indicate that Kelly attended the same church service as the Moore family on the night of June 9th, 1912, only hours before the murders occurred. Witnesses later reported that Kelly displayed unusual behavior during his time in Villisca. Several individuals described him as socially awkward and prone to nervous behavior. According to later reports, Kelly left town shortly after the murders and traveled to multiple locations across several states. In the months following the murders, investigators continued collecting witness statements and reviewing travel records connected to individuals who had passed through Villisca. Kelly's name resurfaced several years later during renewed interest in the case. In 1917, approximately 5 years after the murders, authorities revisited the case and began focusing more closely on George Kelly. At that time, Kelly was living in Kansas City. Investigators arranged for Kelly to be brought in for questioning. During questioning, authorities noted that Kelly appeared extremely nervous and gave inconsistent answers about his whereabouts on the night of the murders. According to interrogation records, Kelly also displayed an unusual fascination with violent crimes. Investigators later discovered that Kelly had sent letters to authorities discussing the Villisca murders. These letters reportedly included strange statements and references to the crime that investigators believe suggested inside knowledge. During questioning in 1917, George Kelly eventually confessed to committing the murders. However, the circumstances surrounding his confession remain controversial. Historical records indicate that Kelly was subjected to long interrogation sessions, often conducted late into the night. Some reports suggest that Kelly was deprived of sleep during questioning. Eventually, Kelly signed a written confession. According to documentation from the time, Kelly's confession included descriptions of entering the Moore home during the night and attacking the victims with an axe. One reported statement attributed to Kelly read, "I killed the children first, then the others." This statement quickly attracted national attention. However, investigators soon began to question the reliability of Kelly's confession. Many of the details included in his statement were inconsistent with known facts about the crime scene. In some instances, Kelly described actions that did not match physical evidence recorded in the house. Additionally, historians later noted that Kelly had a history of mental instability and unusual behavior. Some experts believe this made him particularly vulnerable to pressure during interrogation. Following his confession, George Kelly was charged with the murders and brought to trial. The trial became a major public event, drawing widespread attention from newspapers across the country. Witnesses were called to testify regarding Kelly's behavior before and after the murders. However, defense attorneys argued that Kelly's confession had been pressured. They emphasized the length of the interrogations and the lack of physical evidence connecting Kelly directly to the crime scene. During the trial, prosecutors struggled to present definitive proof linking Kelly to the murders. No physical evidence placed him inside the Moore residence. No eyewitness testimony confirmed his involvement. Ultimately, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. The trial ended in a hung jury, meaning jurors could not agree on whether Kelly was guilty or innocent. As a result, George Kelly was released. Despite his confession, he was never convicted of the Villisca murders. Following his release, Kelly continued to deny responsibility for the murders. Authorities considered retrying the case, but over time, momentum behind the prosecution faded. Kelly eventually moved away from the region and lived out the remainder of his life without being convicted of the crime. To this day, historians and investigators remain divided on whether George Kelly was truly responsible for the murders, or whether his confession was a result of pressure and exhaustion during interrogation. In addition to George Kelly, investigators continue to examine other possible suspects connected to the Moore family. One of the most frequently discussed individuals was Frank Jones, a prominent businessman in Villisca. Frank Jones had previously employed Josiah Moore before Moore left Jones' business to establish his own hardware store. Some investigators believed there may have been professional tension between the two men. Rumors circulated that Moore's departure from Jones's business created resentment, although documented proof of hostility between the two men remains limited. Additional speculation involved allegations of a personal dispute connected to individuals associated with Jones. However, no physical evidence was ever found linking Frank Jones directly to the murders. Despite the lack of evidence, suspicion remained in public discussion for years. Investigators also explored the possibility that the murders were part of a larger pattern of violent crimes. Some historians have noted similarities between the Villisca murders and other unsolved axe murders reported across the Midwest during the early 1900s. These similarities included attacks occurring during nighttime hours, victims killed while sleeping, use of an axe found within the home, windows and mirrors being covered, and entire households targeted. One individual connected to this theory was William Mansfield, who had been suspected in other violent crimes. Private investigator J.N. Wilkerson strongly believed Mansfield was responsible for multiple axe murders across several states. Wilkerson attempted to connect Mansfield to the Villisca crime through witness testimony and travel records. However, Mansfield maintained that he was not present in Villisca at the time of the murders. Witnesses provided statements supporting his alibi, placing him in another state during the time frame of the crime. Due to this alibi, authorities were unable to formally charge Mansfield. Despite years and years and years of investigation, multiple suspects, and even a confession from George Kelly, authorities were never able to secure a conviction. Several key factors contributed to the case remaining unsolved, like crime scene contamination, conflicting testimony. Witness accounts often contributed or contradicted each other, making it difficult to establish a reliable timeline. There was weak physical evidence, meaning there was no definitive forensic evidence connected any suspect directly to the murders. Questionable confessions. The confession given by George Kelly was widely considered unreliable due to his inconsistencies and his mental state. And of course, limited forensic technology. Investigators lacked modern tools that might have identified the killer quicker. Because of these combined factors, the Villisca murders gradually became a cold case. Over time, public attention shifted, and investigative resources were redirected to newer crimes. However, the memory of what happened inside the Moore home never fully disappeared. The Villisca murders remain one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history. The killings shocked communities across the Midwest and were widely reported in national newspapers. Even decades later, the case continued to attract attention from historians, journalists, and investigators seeking answers. And as years passed, something else began to develop around the property where the murders occurred. Not just historical interests, but reports of unexplained activity, unusual sounds, and claims that the house itself had become a site of paranormal activity. In the years following the murders of June 10, 1912, the house where the crimes occurred remained standing at 508 East 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa. For several decades after the murders, the home continued to be occupied by different people. Historical records indicate that some later residents reported experiencing unusual occurrences inside the home, although early documentation of paranormal claims was limited. By the mid to late 1900s, the property began to gain attention from individuals interested in paranormal research. Interest in the location increased significantly as the murders became more widely studied and discussed in books, documentaries, and historical investigations. Eventually, the property became widely known as the Villisca Axe Murder House, attracting visitors from across the United States. Some of the earliest reported activity came from individuals who lived in the home after the murders. According to historical accounts, residents described hearing unexplained noises during nighttime hours. These reports included footsteps heard when no one else was present, sounds resembling doors opening or closing, and objects appearing to be moved from their original positions. While these claims were not formally investigated at the time, they contributed to the growing reputation of the home as a location associated with unexplained events. By the late 20th century, the Villisca house had become a recognized site within paranormal investigation communities. Ownership of the home changed hands multiple times, and eventually, the property was restored to resemble its original 1912 appearance. The house was later open to the public for historical tours and overnight stays. These overnight visits became a major source of reported paranormal experiences. Visitors began documenting their experiences through written reports, audio recordings, and video footage. According to visitor logs and investigative reports, several types of activity have been repeatedly described. One of the most frequently reported claims involves unexplained sounds. Visitors have reported footsteps in empty rooms, knocking sounds on walls, movement heard on staircases when no one was visible. Another commonly reported experience involves voices. Some visitors claim to have heard voices resembling children. These reports often described whispering sounds, laughter, or soft crying noises. Because the victims included 6 children, these reports are often connected to theories that the spirits of the Moore children or Stilling or sisters remain in the home. However, no scientific confirmation of these claims has ever been established. Modern paranormal investigators visiting the location have reported capturing electronic voice phenomena, commonly referred to as EVP. EVP refers to audio recordings believed to contain voices not heard at the time of recording. Investigators claim to have recorded unexplained sounds or words during sessions conducted inside the home. These recordings are typically reviewed later to identify possible speech patterns. While EVP recordings are widely discussed within paranormal communities, their interpretation remains controversial and is not universally accepted as scientific evidence. In addition to sounds and voices, some visitors have reported physical sensations while inside the home. These reported experiences include sudden drops in temperature, feelings of being watched, unexplained anxiety or panic, and dizziness or nausea. In rare cases, visitors have reported fainting or requesting medical assistance after overnight stays. One widely reported modern incident involved a visitor who suffered a head injury during an overnight investigation. According to published reports, the individual struck their head after an unexplained fall inside the house. No clear cause was officially determined. More than a century after the murders of June 10, 1912, the home where the killings occurred still stands in Villisca, Iowa. Today, the house is known as the Villisca Axe Murder House, and it operates as both a historical landmark and a paranormal tourism destination. The structure has been restored to closely resemble its original appearance from 1912. Furniture and layout inside the home have been arranged to match historical records and photographs from the period. Visitors can tour the house during the day to learn about the murders and the investigation. In addition to daytime hours, overnight stays are permitted for individuals interested in paranormal investigation. These overnight visits have contributed significantly to the house's modern reputation. Paranormal investigators and tourists from across the country regularly travel to Villisca to spend the night inside the home. The Villisca murders themselves remain one of the most widely studied unsolved crimes in American history. Historians, journalists, and investigators have spent decades reviewing records, witness statements, and suspect histories in an effort to identify the killer. However, the identity of the person responsible for the murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters remains unknown. No one has ever been convicted. No definitive suspect has been confirmed, and more than 100 years later, the case remains officially unsolved. The events that took place inside the Moore home on June 10, 1912, permanently changed the town of Villisca. The crime reshaped how small communities viewed safety, trust, and vulnerability. It also left behind a lasting legacy, one that continues to draw attention from historians and paranormal investigators alike. Today, the house stands not only as a reminder of violence, but as a symbol of unanswered questions. 8 lives were taken in a single night. A crime scene was left behind. Despite years of investigation, arrests, and confessions, the truth was never fully uncovered. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, be sure to follow the Nite Krew on TikTok and Instagram. And you can listen on YouTube, Spotify, Podbean, and iHeartRadio as well. And if you enjoy true crime, paranormal encounters, and supernatural stories, there's always more waiting in the dark. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and stay in the shadows.